She saved a billionaire and got an incredible reward the next day. The dim hum of the restaurant clattered to a halt as he stared at her, stunned into silence. His fork hung midair, the edges of his perfectly tailored suit stiff with disbelief. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice tight and guarded, like a man tiptoeing on cracking ice. Across the table, his friend froze, his smile faltering under the weight of the waitress's quiet words. She hadn't planned to say it, not like this, but the look in the billionaire's eyes demanded an answer, a final, unwavering truth. And so she whispered, "I thought you should know what I saw." The Iron Sparrow was a chic, upscale restaurant nestled in the heart of downtown Manhattan, where polished surfaces gleamed under soft golden lights and every patron seemed pulled from the glossy pages of luxury magazines. Here, people closed deals over rare vintages of wine and exchanged secrets behind crystal tumblers of whiskey. It was a haven for the elite, a place where power and wealth mingled seamlessly under the watchful eyes of its staff. Clara worked the dinner rush most evenings. The youngest waitress on the team, she had a knack for remembering intricate orders and a disarming smile that made even the most demanding customers pause. But tonight, there was a tension in the air, a ripple that made her spine tingle. At table 17 sat two men who demanded attention, even in their unassuming posture. One was unmistakable: Julian Hayes, the reclusive tech billionaire whose empire had reshaped the digital world. Tall, with dark hair swept carelessly back and an air of sharp precision, he spoke in calm, measured tones. His dining companion, Andrew Voss, was the opposite, louder, more animated, with laughter that boomed like thunder. While Julian's aura demanded respect, Andrew was the kind of man who craved attention and took up space effortlessly. Clara had seen her share of high-profile clients, but something about the dynamic between Julian and Andrew gnawed at her. It wasn't just the contrast in their personalities. It was the subtle tension in Julian's jaw when Andrew spoke, the way his sharp eyes scanned the room as though he were bracing for something. As the evening wore on, Clara moved about her tables, weaving through the lively crowd. She couldn't help but notice how Andrew charmed the servers, leaning in just a little too close, his compliments slick and practiced. It was when she approached their table to refill their drinks that she caught the first hint of something darker. Andrew's phone sat face up on the table, its screen alight with an incoming message. Clara's glance was fleeting, but her pulse quickened as the words seared into her mind. "Funds transferred. Next move," a brief message, but loaded with implications. Andrew quickly turned the phone over, his smile never faltering as he continued his story about a recent business trip. Clara's mind raced as she continued her shift. Was it her place to say something? She didn't know the details of Julian and Andrew's relationship, nor the context of the message. But the unease in her chest refused to quiet. Every interaction she witnessed between the two men added weight to her suspicions. Julian's trust seemed implicit, even as Andrew's demeanor grew more questionable with every passing moment. As the evening wound down and the Iron Sparrow's patrons began to thin, Clara knew she had a choice to make. Julian Hayes, for all his wealth and power, seemed oblivious to the storm gathering in Andrew's shadow. And Clara, she could either keep her head down or speak up and risk everything. Clara couldn't shake the unease as she cleared nearby tables and refilled water glasses. Her years as a waitress had trained her to observe people, to pick up on subtleties others overlooked: the shift in tone, a lingering glance, a too easy smile masking discomfort. Tonight, all those instincts pointed her back to table 17. Andrew's charm was undeniable. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing animatedly as if the room revolved around him. Every so often, though, Clara noticed his eyes flickering over to Julian, as though gauging his reaction. Julian's responses were measured, polite, yet something about his body language, a tight grip on his fork, a subtle tilt of his head betrayed discomfort. Clara couldn't tell if Julian sensed it or if years of friendship told his instincts. What gnawed at her most was that message: funds transferred. Next move. She replayed it in her mind, trying to assign it some innocuous meaning, but none fit. The tone was clinical, deliberate, more like a strategy than a casual update. Andrew had covered his phone quickly, but not before she caught the flicker of guilt in his expression, a brief shadow behind his affable mask. As she returned to the kitchen, Clara weighed her options. What was she even considering? Interrupting the meal of one of the wealthiest men in the world to speculate about his friend's intentions. The very thought seemed absurd, but the more she tried to ignore it, the stronger the compulsion became. Julian Hayes wasn't just some powerful stranger. He was, by all accounts, a kind and philanthropic man whose quiet generosity had changed lives. If Andrew was exploiting that trust, Clara couldn't live with herself if she said nothing. Halfway through her internal debate, her coworker Jenny nudged her as she prepped plates for another table. "You okay? You've been quiet," Jenny said, her brow furrowed. Clara hesitated, glancing back toward the dining area. "It's probably nothing," she murmured, "but have you ever gotten a bad feeling about someone?" Jenny shrugged, following Clara's gaze to Andrew. "Him? I mean, he's loud, sure, but he's not the worst we've seen here." Clara bit her lip. "Yeah, maybe you're right." Still, her instincts wouldn't let go. By the time dessert was served at table 17, Clara had made her decision. She approached their table carefully, her heart pounding like a drum. "Excuse me," she began, her voice steady but low. "Mr. Hayes." Julian looked up, startled by her directness. "Yes." Andrew glanced between them, his expression guarded now. "Is something wrong?" he asked, his tone lighter than his eyes. Clara took a breath. It's probably not my place, but I saw something earlier. I think it's important." The table fell silent. The soft clinking of glasses and muted chatter from other tables seemed a world away. Julian set down his fork and leaned forward. "Go on," he said, his tone calm but edged with curiosity. Andrew stiffened, a shadow flickering across his face. "Clara, is it?" he asked smoothly. "Whatever it is, I'm sure it's nothing." But Clara didn't stop. Clara's throat felt dry, but she pushed forward, her voice steady. "I couldn't help noticing something earlier," she said, her gaze firmly on Julian. "When I was refilling your glasses, I saw a message on your friend's phone. It said, 'Funds transferred, next move.'" Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for a moment, no one spoke. Julian's face remained neutral, though his eyes sharpened, his mind clearly processing every detail. Andrew, on the other hand, let out a short laugh, though it sounded forced. "Seriously," Andrew said, shaking his head with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "A text message. This is why I keep my phone face down in places like this. People love to misinterpret things." Julian's focus never wavered from Clara. "Why did you feel the need to tell me this?" he asked quietly, his tone neither accusatory nor dismissive, but probing, like he was measuring her intentions. Clara hesitated. "I know it's not my place," she admitted. "But you seem like a decent man. I've worked here long enough to recognize people with real character. And..." She glanced at Andrew, who was still smiling but now leaned forward slightly, his body language defensive. "That message just didn't sit right with me." Andrew leaned back in his chair, scoffing. "This is ridiculous. Do you know who you're talking to? Julian and I go way back. We've been through things you can't even imagine. She's just fishing for drama." Julian raised a hand, silencing him. "Andrew, let her speak." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he fell silent, his demeanor now less amused and more calculating. Clara drew a steadying breath. "It's not just the message," she said, her voice quieter now. "It's the way you've been acting all night. It feels like you're playing the part of the best friend, but something about it doesn't feel genuine. I know it's none of my business," she added quickly, "but I've seen people like you." She glanced at Andrew. "And people like you," she finished, looking at Julian. "One always ends up trusting too much." Julian's face was unreadable, but the slight narrowing of his eyes suggested her words had landed. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Clara felt her chest tighten under the weight of his silence. She had just risked her job, her reputation, and possibly her safety by speaking out. What if she'd misread the situation entirely? Finally, Julian spoke, his voice calm but cold. "Andrew, do you have something to say about this?" Andrew laughed again, but this time it was laced with annoyance. "Honestly, Jules, this is insane. You're going to take the word of a waitress over me. After everything we've built together." His tone turned indignant. "What did you expect her to say? People like her see a couple of rich guys and start spinning conspiracy theories." Julian ignored Andrew and turned back to Clara. "What exactly did the message say?" he asked, his voice sharper now, urgent. "Exactly what I told you," Clara said. "Funds transferred. Next move." Andrew's smile cracked. Andrew's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of irritation that he quickly masked with a casual shrug. "For God's sake, Jules," he said, his tone sharp but feigning patience. Do you know how many deals I juggle in a day? Of course there's talk of funds and next moves it's business. What's ridiculous is that we're sitting here entertaining this nonsense from someone who knows nothing about us. Julian leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied his friend. He was known for his calm, almost detached demeanor, but Clara could see the calculation in his gaze. It was as though every moment he'd spent with Andrew was being replayed and reevaluated in his mind. Clara, Julian said, his tone measured, you had no reason to come forward other than your gut instinct. Am I correct? Yes, Clara said, her voice steady despite the knot of nerves tightening in her stomach. I know this is a leap, but I couldn't just ignore it. Stop, Andrew interrupted, his voice now carrying a sharp edge. I can't believe we're giving this time. Jules, let's just pay the check and leave. This is a waste of energy. Julian didn't move, his piercing gaze fixed on Andrew, silent but commanding. It was clear he was no longer listening to Andrew's protests. Instead, he was watching, waiting. Clara saw it through the cracks in Andrew's composure. The way his shoulders tightened, the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his drink. He took a sip, trying to project ease, but the effort was painfully transparent. Andrew, Julian said finally, his voice calm but firm. Unlock your phone. Andrew froze. Excuse me, you heard me. Julian's tone was steely now, no longer the patient friend but the man who had built an empire on unrelenting precision. If it's just business, prove it. Show me the message. Andrew laughed again, but it was hollow, shaky. Are you serious? You're going to let her, he gestured toward Clara, plant these crazy ideas in your head and now you're asking me to prove my innocence. What happened to trust, Jules? Trust isn't blind, Julian said, his voice cutting through the din of the restaurant like a knife. Show me the message, Andrew. For a moment, the table was silent, the tension so thick Clara felt as though the room itself had stopped breathing. Andrew's hand hovered over his phone, indecision flashing across his face. Then he smirked, leaning back in his chair. You really want to do this, he said, his voice low, almost a threat. Fine. He unlocked his phone and slid it across the table. Julian's eyes flicked down to the screen. He tapped once, twice, and then his expression hardened. Clara couldn't see what was on the phone, but the air around Julian seemed to change, his calm demeanor giving way to something colder, sharper. What is this? Julian's voice was dangerously quiet, but the fury simmering beneath the surface was unmistakable. Andrew didn't answer. Clara's pulse quickened. She had been right. Julian's fingers tightened around Andrew's phone as his eyes darted across the screen. The muscles in his jaw clenched, and his calm, analytical exterior began to crack. Whatever he had found, it was worse than Clara had imagined. Answer me, Julian said, his voice low and controlled, but carrying the weight of barely contained rage. He held up the phone, its screen glowing with damning evidence. What is this? Andrew's smirk faltered. Look, Jules, it's not what it seems. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Then explain, Julian snapped, his tone brooking no argument. He tossed the phone back onto the table, the sound echoing in the now quiet restaurant. Heads turned, and a murmur rippled through the nearby tables, but Julian didn't seem to care. His entire focus was locked on Andrew. Clara took a cautious step back, feeling the weight of the moment but unwilling to retreat entirely. She had started this, and now she needed to see it through. Andrew hesitated, his usually confident demeanor crumbling under Julian's unrelenting gaze. It's just a deal, he said finally, his voice shaky. A side project. I didn't want to bother you with it because I knew you'd overthink it. A deal, Julian repeated, his tone laced with disbelief. A deal that involves transferring funds to an untraceable offshore account. A deal where you're referring to me as the mark. He practically spat the last word, his anger now fully unleashed. Clara's heart sank. She had suspected something was off, but the reality of Andrew's betrayal hit harder than she'd anticipated. Julian's words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and the betrayal etched across his face was almost painful to witness. Andrew's mask of bravado slipped completely. Okay, fine, he said, his voice rising defensively. Yes, I've been moving some funds around, but it's not what you think. Look, Jules, you're a great guy, but you're too trusting. I've been helping you protect yourself getting ahead of people who'd screw you over. Julian stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he loomed over Andrew. Protect me, he said, his voice icy, by stealing from me. By using our friendship to siphon money and plot behind my back. How long has this been going on? Andrew flinched but held his ground. It's business, Jules. You wouldn't understand. You've been so focused on playing the noble genius that you don't see how cutthroat this world is. I was doing what needed to be done. What needed to be done? Julian repeated, incredulous. You think betraying my trust, stealing from my company, and manipulating me was necessary? Andrew opened his mouth to respond, but Julian cut him off, his voice rising for the first time. You're done. Do you hear me? Whatever we had friendship, partnership, it's over. I'll have my legal team sort out your mess, and you'll pay back every cent. Andrew's face darkened. You're making a mistake, he hissed. You'll regret this, Jules. But Julian didn't waver. The tension at the table reached a breaking point. Julian's fury was palpable, an energy that seemed to ripple through the restaurant, silencing the lingering hum of conversations. Andrew's mask had completely slipped now, and his true self, conniving, arrogant, and unrepentant, was on full display. I'll regret this, Julian said, his voice low but with an edge sharp enough to cut steel. He leaned in closer, towering over Andrew. The only thing I regret is not seeing you for what you are sooner. Andrew scoffed, his bravado slipping into desperation. Oh, spare me the righteous act, Jules. You think you're better than everyone because you've got money and a clean conscience. That's not how the world works. If you don't make moves, someone else makes them for you. I was looking out for both of us. For both of us. Julian's laugh was cold, devoid of humor. You weren't protecting anyone but yourself. You're a parasite, Andrew. Feeding off my trust, my success, and my resources while pretending to be my friend. Andrew's expression twisted with anger. Fine, he spat. You want the truth? Yeah, I used you. You were so wrapped up in your little moral crusades you didn't even notice. Do you think your empire runs on goodwill alone? People like me make it happen behind the scenes. And let me tell you something, if it wasn't me, it would have been someone else. You're naive, Julian. Always have been. Julian straightened, his jaw set in grim determination. He glanced briefly at Clara, who stood nearby, her presence an anchor of clarity amidst the chaos. Her courage to speak up had been the catalyst for this confrontation, and Julian felt a sudden wave of gratitude amidst his anger. Get out, Julian said, his tone final. Get out of my sight, and don't ever try to contact me again. I'll deal with the fallout, but you, Andrew Voss, you're done. Andrew froze, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He opened his mouth as though to argue but seemed to realize the futility of it. With a sharp exhale, he grabbed his phone and stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. You'll see, he said, his voice low but dripping with venom. When the world chews you up and spits you out, you'll wish you'd listened to me. Julian didn't respond. He merely stood tall, his arms crossed as he watched Andrew storm out of the restaurant, the doors swinging violently in his wake. The air seemed to shift, the suffocating tension slowly easing. Clara finally allowed herself to exhale, the tightness in her chest releasing. She glanced at Julian, who sank back into his chair, running a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted, as though the weight of the betrayal had finally settled on his shoulders. I'm sorry, Clara said softly, and sure if she'd overstepped. I didn't mean to cause a scene. Julian looked up at her, his expression a mix of gratitude and weariness. Don't apologize, he said. You may have just saved me. Julian sat back in his chair, staring at the empty seat where Andrew had been moments before. The weight of betrayal pressed heavily on him, and for the first time in years, he felt unsure of his own judgment. How had he not seen it? The signs were there, small inconsistencies in Andrew's stories, the unusually aggressive business maneuvers, the charm that often bordered on manipulation. Are you okay? Clara asked hesitantly, stepping closer. She held her tray tightly against her chest, her voice soft but steady. Julian looked up at her, his dark eyes scanning her face as though seeing her for the first time. I don't know, he admitted. I've trusted Andrew with things I wouldn't tell anyone else. And to find out he trailed off, shaking his head. Clara hesitated before speaking. Sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to see clearly, she said. You trusted him because you believed in him. That's not a flaw, Mr. Hayes. That's being human. Julian let out a bitter chuckle. Being human doesn't exactly inspire confidence when you're running an empire. He gestured toward the empty seat. That man had access to everything, my company, my accounts, my life. Who knows how far this betrayal goes? Clara sat on the edge of the empty chair, uninvited but not unwelcome. You'll figure it out, she said simply. You don't strike me as someone who lets obstacles stop them. And for what it's worth, it seems like you have a lot of people rooting for you. Julian studied her, a faint smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. Including you. She blushed slightly but nodded. I didn't have to say anything tonight. It would have been easier not to. But I couldn't stand by and watch someone take advantage of you. He exhaled deeply, his expression softening. Thank you. What you did took guts. Not many people would have had the courage to speak up. Clara shrugged, her lips curving into a faint smile. Guess I've seen enough bad people get away with things because no one called them out. I figured it was worth the risk. Julian nodded, his gaze distant for a moment as though replaying the night's events in his mind. You've given me something I can't repay, he said finally, his voice steady but filled with emotion. A chance to fix this before it's too late. Clara stood, sensing the conversation nearing its natural end. I'm glad I could help, she said. But maybe take a break from trusting people who think they're smarter than everyone else. She flashed him a quick grin before heading back toward the kitchen. Julian watched her leave, feeling the faintest flicker of hope amid his exhaustion. Clara's bravery and honesty had been a beacon in what could have been a disastrous night. He knew the road ahead would be messy, sorting out Andrew's schemes, protecting his company, and repairing his fractured trust, but for the first time in hours, he didn't feel entirely alone. And that, he realized, was a start. The restaurant's hum slowly resumed as Julian remained seated, staring blankly at the untouched dessert on his table. The weight of Andrew's betrayal lingered, but Clara's words echoed in his mind. That's not a flaw. That's being human. He signaled for the check, and when the manager approached, Julian asked for Clara specifically. She appeared moments later, looking both surprised and a little apprehensive. I wanted to thank you again, Julian said as he slipped his credit card into the billfold. Not just for speaking up, but for how you did it. You could have embarrassed me or gone to the press, but you didn't. Clara shook her head. That's not why I said anything. You deserve to know, and I figured you'd handle it with more grace than most people would. Julian smirked faintly, though his exhaustion was evident. Grace might not be the word I'd use, but I appreciate the vote of confidence. He paused, then asked, do you always trust your gut like that? Clara hesitated. Not always, she admitted. But when something feels off, it's hard to ignore. Andrew, he gave me that feeling from the start. I just didn't know why until tonight. Julian nodded, his expression thoughtful. It's a rare thing, trusting your instincts when it matters, and rarer still to act on them. Clara smiled faintly but didn't respond, sensing he had more to say. Julian exhaled and leaned forward slightly. This whole thing has opened my eyes, not just to Andrew but to myself. I've been so focused on building my company, on trusting the people closest to me to help carry that weight, that I've stopped paying attention to the cracks forming beneath the surface. Clara tilted her head. Do you regret trusting him? Yes, Julian said after a pause, his voice firm. But I don't regret believing in him. There's a difference. Their conversation was interrupted by the manager, who handed Julian a receipt and a pen. Julian signed it quickly, leaving an extraordinarily generous tip before standing. He looked at Clara again, this time with genuine gratitude in his eyes. Clara, if you ever decide to leave this place, I hope you'll reach out to me, he said, handing her a sleek business card. People like you, brave, honest, perceptive, they're hard to find. I could use someone like that. Clara blinked, surprised by the gesture. She took the card hesitantly, unsure of what to say. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I'll think about it. Julian, he corrected, a faint smile touching his lips. Take care of yourself, Clara, and trust your instincts, they seem to serve you well. With that, Julian left the restaurant, stepping out into the cool Manhattan night. The weight of the evening hadn't lifted entirely, but there was a clarity in his stride now, a sense of purpose as he walked to his waiting car. The fallout with Andrew would come, but he was ready to face it. Clara's courage had given him something invaluable, the resolve to take back control. Inside, Clara watched him go, her grip tightening on the card. The next day dawned crisp and clear, but Julian's mind was already buried beneath the storm of tasks ahead. He sat in his sprawling corner office, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city below, but the usual view offered him no solace. On his desk was Andrew's file compiled overnight by his legal and security teams. The details were damning. Over the last year, Andrew had systematically funneled money from joint investments into shell companies, covering his tracks with layers of fake documentation. He'd exploited his role as Julian's confidant, leveraging insider knowledge to execute moves that had jeopardized the stability of Julian's empire. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was deeply personal. Julian leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he processed the information. There would be lawsuits, criminal investigations, and a media frenzy. His PR team was already crafting a statement, but Julian knew this wasn't just about damage control. This was about rebuilding not just his company, but his ability to trust again. Mr. Hayes, his assistant, Linda, said from the doorway, her voice soft but urgent. There's a reporter from the Times requesting a comment on Andrew Voss. They claim they've received an anonymous tip. Julian sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. No comment for now. Redirect them to our legal team. Linda nodded and retreated, leaving Julian in silence. He turned his chair toward the window, staring out at the skyline. It wasn't the chaos of the press or the fallout that troubled him most, it was the lingering question of how he had allowed Andrew to deceive him for so long. You're too trusting, Andrew had said, and though Julian hated to admit it, there was a kernel of truth in those words. Meanwhile, at the Iron Sparrow, Clara found herself distracted as she worked the breakfast shift. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, especially the way Julian had thanked her. She glanced at the sleek business card he'd given her, which she now kept tucked in the pocket of her apron. It felt surreal to know she'd stepped into the world of someone so powerful, even if only briefly. Jenny, her coworker, noticed her zoning out. Hey, she said, nudging Clara with a tray. You okay? You've been staring into space for 5 minutes. Clara smiled sheepishly. Yeah, just thinking about last night. Jenny grinned. You mean your billionaire savior? Come on, what's the story there? Did he offer to whisk you away in a private jet? Clara laughed. Hardly, but he did say I should reach out to him if I ever wanted a change. Jenny's eyes widened. And you're just now telling me this? What are you waiting for? That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Clara shrugged, her smile fading slightly. I don't know. It's flattering, but it's a whole different world. What if I don't belong there? Jenny shook her head firmly. You stood up to a billionaire's shady best friend in the middle of dinner service. You belong anywhere you decide to be. Clara looked at her friend, her doubts beginning to fade. Maybe she did belong somewhere bigger. By mid-afternoon, Clara had finished her shift and lingered in the staff break room, the card Julian had given her now resting in her palm. Its clean, minimalist design bore only his name, Julian Hayes, and a single email address. She traced the embossed letters with her finger, debating her next move. Her coworkers had all weighed in throughout the day: Jenny's enthusiasm, Carlos's insistence she shouldn't overthink it, and even the kitchen staff jokingly asking if she needed a chauffeur now. But beneath the humor and encouragement, Clara knew the decision was hers alone. She stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. You stood up for what you believed in, she muttered to herself. You can do this. With a deep breath, she tucked the card into her purse and left the restaurant, the cool city air welcoming her as she stepped outside. On the other side of the city, Julian sat in a conference room with his legal team, their voices a steady hum as they laid out the plan to deal with Andrew. The fallout was extensive. Andrew's betrayal had ripple effects across several projects, but nothing irreparable. Still, Julian felt the weight of every decision. Mr. Hayes, his lawyer, Eleanor, said, breaking his thoughts. You'll need to decide how public you want to go with this. We can bury most of the details, but it might be worth making a statement to show transparency. Julian considered her words carefully. He'd always prided himself on integrity, but now, that very value had been weaponized against him. No, he said finally, I won't hide this. Draft a statement, but keep it factual. Andrew's actions will speak for themselves. Eleanor nodded. Understood. And Clara, the waitress who brought this to your attention. Do you want her included in any statements? Julian shook his head. No. She did the right thing, but I won't drag her into this mess. I'll thank her privately. Eleanor smiled faintly. That's probably wise. As the meeting adjourned, Julian returned to his office. Sitting at his desk, He opened his laptop and began drafting an email. Hours later, Clara returned to her small apartment, her purse slung over her shoulder and a grocery bag in hand. She set it down and sank into her worn-out couch, exhausted but restless. She reached for her phone and stared at the card again, its stark simplicity calling to her. Finally, with a resolve she hadn't felt earlier, she opened her email app and began typing. The next morning, Julian sat at his desk, sipping his coffee when a notification appeared on his screen. He clicked it, his lips curving into a small smile as he read. Subject: Thank you. Dear Mr. Hayes, thank you for your kind words and the opportunity you offered me. I don't know what the future holds, but I'd love to explore how I can help. Let me know if there's a good time to talk. Best, Clara. Julian leaned back, his smile lingering. Perhaps last night had marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Clara stared at her phone the next morning, her stomach flipping with a mix of nerves and excitement. She hadn't expected a reply so soon, but there it was, sitting in her inbox. Subject: Next steps. Dear Clara, thank you for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss how we might work together. Let me know your availability, and we'll arrange a meeting. Best regards, Julian Hayes. The formality of the email didn't mask its warmth. Clara could almost hear Julian's calm, composed voice behind the words, and it steadied her nerves. After taking a deep breath, she replied, suggesting a time that afternoon, her fingers trembling as she hit send. For the rest of the morning, she vacillated between excitement and doubt. What would this meeting be like? What did Julian see in her waitress with no professional connections to his world that made him think she could contribute? She didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let fear stop her from finding out. That afternoon, Clara found herself in a gleaming high-rise in Midtown Manhattan, far removed from the bustling restaurant where she worked. The lobby was pristine, with polished marble floors and a glass chandelier that refracted sunlight into a kaleidoscope of colors. Clara approached the receptionist, who directed her to the 42nd floor with a professional smile. As the elevator ascended, Clara felt her nerves bubbling to the surface. She glanced at her reflection in the mirrored walls, adjusting the hem of her blouse and smoothing her hair. By the time the doors opened, she'd managed to collect herself, or at least appear as if she had. Julian's office was a study in understated elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in natural light, and modern furniture was arranged with precision. Julian stood by the window, dressed in a tailored gray suit that exuded effortless authority. He turned as Clara entered, offering her a genuine smile. "Clara," he said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Clara shook his hand, trying to keep her voice steady. "Thank you for inviting me. This is impressive." Julian gestured for her to sit. "I'll admit, it's a bit different from the Iron Sparrow," he said, his tone light, breaking the tension. "But I meant what I said last night. You have qualities I value: perception, integrity, and the courage to act on both. Those are rare traits, especially in my world." Clara blinked, surprised. "I don't know if I've ever thought of myself like that. I just did what I thought was right." Julian leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "That's exactly why I think you'll succeed. You don't overthink it, you trust your instincts. And right now, I need someone like that, someone who can see what others miss, who can tell me the truth when no one else will." Clara hesitated. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Julian smiled. "Let's start with a conversation. I think we can figure it out together." The conversation with Julian unfolded with surprising ease. Clara had expected intimidating business jargon or questions designed to make her prove herself, but Julian's tone was approachable, his words deliberate and thoughtful. He genuinely wanted to know her perspective, and that disarmed her more than anything. "I'm restructuring a few areas in my company," Julian explained. "Andrew's betrayal highlighted gaps in oversight and a lack of diverse voices around me. Too many people tell me what they think I want to hear. I need someone who isn't afraid to challenge assumptions or point out blind spots." Clara leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "I get that," she said, "but I'm not a business person. I don't have experience in, well, anything like this." Julian smiled. "That's precisely why I'm interested. Your perspective is untethered by the biases that come from being entrenched in this world. Last night, you made an observation that everyone around me missed, including me. You acted on it, even when it was risky. Those are the qualities I'm looking for." Clara hesitated, So, what would I actually do? For now, I'd like to bring you in as a consultant, Julian said. You'd work closely with me, attending key meetings and providing your honest take on what you observe. Think of it as a second pair of eyes, someone who can identify patterns, behaviors, and details that others might overlook. It's a trial run, but if it works out, we'll see where it leads. The proposal left Clara momentarily speechless. It sounded like something out of a movie. A waitress pulled into the high-stakes world of billionaires, her instincts and integrity valued over polished resumes and degrees. Part of her wanted to jump at the chance immediately, but doubt crept in. What if I fail? She asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. Julian's gaze softened. Failure is part of the process, he said. I've failed more times than I can count. But you've already proven you have the courage to try, and that's more than most people can say. Clara considered his words, turning them over in her mind. He wasn't asking her to be perfect, just to be herself, to trust the instincts that had brought her to this moment. Finally, she nodded, her resolve solidifying. Okay, she said. I'll do it. Julian's expression brightened, a genuine relief crossing his face. I think this is the start of something good, he said, standing and extending a hand. Clara shook it, her nerves giving way to a cautious excitement. I hope so, she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. As Julian walked her to the elevator, he outlined a few next steps: a formal introduction to his team, a schedule for her first few meetings. By the time she stepped into the elevator, Clara felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was searching for. As the doors closed and the city came back into view, she clutched Julian's card, now a symbol of the leap she'd just taken. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she truly belonged. The days that followed marked a whirlwind of change for Clara. She spent her mornings tying up loose ends at the Iron Sparrow and her afternoons stepping into Julian Hayes' world. It was overwhelming at first, the stark contrast between the two lives she was balancing. One moment, she was pouring coffee and clearing plates. The next, she was sitting in a glass-walled boardroom, surrounded by polished executives. Julian was true to his word, giving her space to find her footing while also encouraging her to speak up. At first, Clara hesitated, unsure of what she could possibly add to conversations dominated by terms and strategies she didn't fully understand. But Julian had a way of drawing her out, asking her direct questions and valuing her unfiltered perspective. It was during one of these meetings, about a week into her new role, that she had her first real breakthrough. The team was discussing a high-profile acquisition, a struggling tech company that Julian's firm had been eyeing for months. The executives debated logistics, market shares, and integration plans, their voices blending into a symphony of expertise that left Clara feeling out of place. But then, she noticed something. One of the company's representatives, a man who had been silent for most of the meeting, seemed unusually tense. Clara leaned toward Julian, speaking softly so only he could hear. That guy, she said, nodding discreetly toward the man. He's nervous about something. Julian glanced at her, then at the representative, his expression unreadable. Instead of dismissing her observation, he shifted the conversation. Mr. Larkin, Julian said, his voice calm but pointed, is there something we should be aware of before we proceed? The room fell silent. Larkin looked startled, then flustered. After a moment, he stammered, there's a pending lawsuit we haven't fully disclosed yet. It's small, but it could affect the timeline. Julian's executives exchanged glances, murmuring in surprise, but Julian's gaze remained steady on the man. I appreciate your honesty, he said. We'll need to address that before moving forward. After the meeting, Julian pulled Clara aside. You saw what no one else did, he said. That detail could have cost us weeks and millions. Don't underestimate what you bring to the table. The confidence in his words bolstered her, and slowly, Clara began to feel like she belonged. She learned to trust her instincts, to speak up even when she doubted herself. And as she grew into her role, Julian's trust in her deepened. Months later, Clara stood at the Iron Sparrow, not as a waitress but as a guest. Julian had invited her to dinner, a quiet celebration of their partnership's success. The restaurant hadn't changed, but she had. She was no longer the unsure waitress wondering if she'd made a mistake by speaking up. You've come a long way, Julian said as they raised their glasses. Clara smiled, reflecting on the path that had brought her here. So have you, she replied. Trusting people again. I mean, Julian nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. Thanks to you. As the night unfolded, Clara realized something profound. Speaking up that fateful night hadn't just changed Julian's life, it had changed her own. And she wouldn't have it any other way. A year later, Clara found herself walking through the lobby of a sleek, modern office building, the headquarters of Julian Hayes' newly restructured empire. The transformation was unmistakable, a reflection of both the challenges they had faced and the progress they had made. Julian's company had weathered the storm of Andrew's betrayal, emerging stronger and more transparent, with Clara playing an integral role in its evolution. She paused at the entrance to a conference room, watching as Julian stood at the head of a long table. He was presenting to a group of investors, his tone confident and measured. Gone was the guarded demeanor she'd seen in those early days after Andrew's departure. He had regained his footing, his trust in others carefully rebuilt brick by brick. When Julian finished, the investors applauded, and as the group filed out, he caught sight of Clara in the doorway. He smiled, gesturing for her to come in. "How's everything coming along?" he asked as she entered, a familiar warmth in his tone. "Busy," Clara replied with a grin, "but good. The mentorship program's nearly finalized. We're on track to roll it out next month." The mentorship program had been Clara's brainchild, a way to give back to the community by providing young professionals from diverse backgrounds access to resources and guidance. It had been a hard sell initially, but Julian had supported her, even when others were skeptical. "I knew you'd pull it off," Julian said. "You've got a habit of making the impossible happen." Clara laughed, shaking her head. "I'm just doing what feels right. Besides, you're the one who keeps giving me opportunities to take risks." "Because you've earned it," Julian said simply. Their partnership had evolved into a friendship, one built on mutual respect and a shared vision for what Julian's company could stand for. Clara no longer felt out of place in this world. She had carved her own path, proving that integrity and instinct could be just as valuable as formal training. As they walked out of the conference room together, Julian glanced at her. "Do you ever think about that night at the Iron Sparrow?" he asked. Clara smiled. "Sometimes. It feels like a lifetime ago." Julian nodded. "It's strange, isn't it? How one moment, one choice can change everything." Clara thought back to the nervous girl who had debated whether to say something that night, her instincts battling her fear of stepping out of line. That moment had set her life on a trajectory she couldn't have imagined, one that had tested her limits and reshaped her future. "I'm glad I made that choice," she said finally, "even if it scared me." Julian smiled. "So am I." As they stepped into the elevator, the city skyline stretched out before them, a testament to resilience and reinvention. Clara knew there would always be challenges ahead, but now she faced them with the confidence she'd earned through hard-fought experience. And in that moment, she realized the truth: sometimes, the greatest risks lead to the most extraordinary rewards.